The photograph still exists in a shoebox somewhere in Cleveland, tucked between birthday cards and receipts no one thought to throw away. It shows two people standing in front of a powder blue Dodge Caravan in the driveway of a split-level house on a Tuesday morning in late September 1990. The woman is holding a road atlas folded open to a page showing the southwestern United States. The man has one hand on the roof rack and the other raised in a mock salute. Behind them, a neighbor is visible in the background carrying groceries from her car. The image is ordinary in every way except one. It was taken 4 hours before they disappeared. Lauren and Greg Fenton were not the kind of people stories are written about. She worked in medical billing at a clinic near the highway, processing insurance claims and fielding phone calls from patients who couldn't understand their statements. He managed inventory at a tool distributor, tracking shipments and arguing with suppliers about delivery schedules. They had been married 6 years, owned a house with a mortgage they complained about at dinner parties, and took one road trip every autumn when the clinic slowed down and Greg could get coverage at the warehouse. In September 1990, they planned to drive to the Grand Canyon, stay in budget motels along the way, and be back by the first Monday in October. It was their 5th trip together. None of the previous 4 had gone wrong. They left Cleveland at 9:47 in the morning on September 25, 1990, precisely when they said they would. The neighbor who took the photograph, a woman named Carol Henderson, remembered Lauren laughing about something Greg had said, something about making sure the cooler didn't leak this time, because last year's trip to the Smoky Mountains had ended with melted ice all over their camping gear. The caravan was packed tight with luggage, a tent they never actually used but brought anyway. Bottled water, protein bars, 2 pillows, and 2 disposable cameras they'd bought at a drugstore the night before. Greg had written the route on a legal pad taped to the dashboard in his careful block handwriting. Indianapolis, St. Louis, Oklahoma City, Amarillo, Flagstaff, then the canyon. 1,200 miles one way, 3 days out, 3 days back, 2 days to see the rocks and take photographs. Lauren had circled the route in red marker and written no shortcuts in the margin, underlined twice because Greg had a habit of finding back roads he thought would save time. If you're watching this because cold cases pull at something you can't name, or because you've ever felt the weight of a question that won't resolve, go ahead and subscribe. We go deep on cases like this one, mysteries that live in the gap between the last confirmed sighting and the years that follow. And drop a comment. Where are you watching from, and have you ever driven a route that felt wrong before you even knew why? The drive from Cleveland to Amarillo took them through the heart of the Midwest in late September, when the corn was tall and the leaves were just beginning to turn. They stopped for lunch at a rest area outside Indianapolis, where Greg bought coffee from a vending machine that tasted like hot water, with a vague suggestion of bitterness. They spent the night at a motel in St. Louis, one of those single-story places near the interstate, with a flickering neon sign and a clerk who barely looked up from his newspaper when they checked in. Lauren called her mother from the room to say they'd arrived safely, that the drive had been uneventful, and that they'd call again from Arizona. Her mother reminded her to drink water and avoid driving at night if they could help it. Lauren promised they would. On the second day, they crossed into Oklahoma under a sky that stretched wider than anything they'd seen back home. Greg drove with the windows down, one arm resting on the door, while Lauren read aloud from a guidebook about the Grand Canyon that she'd checked out from the library. The guidebook was thorough and slightly outdated, published in 1987, with descriptions of trails and overlooks and warnings about dehydration and altitude. Lauren had dog-eared the pages about the South Rim and circled a campground they wanted to visit. She read a passage about how the canyon had been formed over millions of years by the Colorado River cutting through layers of rock, and Greg said it sounded like something you had to see in person to really understand. They reached Amarillo in the late afternoon of September 26th, a Wednesday. The city appeared suddenly on the horizon after miles of flat plains, a cluster of buildings and grain silos rising out of the grassland. They stopped for dinner at a chain restaurant off the interstate, the kind of place with laminated menus and booths by the window. The waitress remembered them later, when investigators came asking, because Lauren had ordered a salad and then asked for extra dressing on the side, and Greg had left a tip that was exactly 15% to the penny. They were polite, quiet, and unremarkable. They paid in cash, left the restaurant at 8:34 p.m. according to the receipt that was later found in Greg's wallet, and got back on the road. The last confirmed sighting of the Fentons occurred at 11:23 p.m. on September 26, 1990, at a gas station 17 miles outside Amarillo, Texas. The station was small, the kind of place that stayed open all night, primarily because the owner lived in an apartment above the garage and couldn't sleep anyway. The attendant on duty was a man named Raymond Hollister, who had worked the night shift for 3 years and had developed a habit of studying the faces of people who stopped after dark, trying to guess where they were going and why they looked tired. He remembered the Fentons because Lauren had asked for directions to a campground she'd seen on a map, and he told her it was privately owned and had been closed for 2 years after the owner died, and the family couldn't agree on what to do with the property. Raymond said Lauren looked disappointed but not upset, just tired in the way people get when a plan changes and they don't have the energy to be frustrated about it. Greg bought a Coke and a bag of peanuts from the rack by the register. Lauren used the restroom, came back, and asked if there were any other campgrounds nearby. Raymond told her the nearest one was another 40 miles west, but that there were motels in Flagstaff if they wanted to push through. Greg mentioned wanting to reach Flagstaff before noon the next day, so they'd have the afternoon to settle in before driving to the canyon. The transaction took less than 4 minutes. Raymond said they seemed in a hurry, but not in a way that raised concern. When they pulled out of the lot, he saw the caravan head west on Route 66, which at that point ran parallel to Interstate 40, but was quieter and less well lit. That was the last time anyone who could later be identified saw them alive. What happened next is a sequence of negatives, a timeline defined by what did not occur rather than what did. They did not check into the campground they'd reserved outside Flagstaff under the name Fenton, confirmed by the campground office when investigators called in October. They did not call Lauren's mother on September 27th, which they had promised to do, and which Lauren had never failed to do on previous trips. They did not use their credit card again after the gas station, confirmed by card company records that showed the last charge at 11:21 p.m. on September 26th. They did not withdraw cash from any ATM, confirmed by bank statements. They did not appear on any traffic camera, though in 1990 those were sparse and poorly archived, and many of the tapes from that period had been recorded over or discarded. They did not call the clinic, the warehouse, or any friend. They simply stopped existing in any recordable way. On October 2nd, when they were supposed to return to Cleveland, Greg's supervisor at the warehouse called the house and got no answer. He tried again 2 hours later, thinking perhaps they'd been delayed by weather or car trouble. When there was still no answer by the end of the workday, he called Lauren's mother, a woman named Joan Pritchard, who lived 20 minutes from the Fentons and had babysat their neighbor's kids when Lauren and Greg went on previous trips. Joan said she hadn't heard from them since the call from St. Louis on September 25th. She tried their home number, got no answer, and felt the first cold thread of worry pull tight in her chest. By 6 p.m. that evening, the first missing persons report had been filed in 2 states, and by midnight, a BOLO alert had been issued for the powder blue Dodge Caravan with Ohio plates. The Caravan was found on October 9, 1990, in a ravine 11 miles south of the highway near the New Mexico border, just inside the Texas Panhandle. A rancher named Clyde Morrison, checking fences on the southern edge of his property, had noticed tire tracks cutting through scrub grass where there shouldn't have been any. He'd followed them on foot for about a quarter mile, expecting to find teenagers who'd driven out to drink or kids joyriding, and instead found the tracks leading to the edge of a shallow drop where the ground gave way to sandstone and hardpan. The van had rolled approximately 40 feet down and come to rest on its side against a cluster of juniper trees. The front bumper was crumpled, the driver's side mirror was gone, and the windshield had fractured into a white starburst pattern, but the vehicle was otherwise intact. There was no fire, there were no bodies. Clyde called the sheriff's department from his truck radio, and by noon a team of deputies and investigators had secured the scene. Inside the van they found luggage still neatly packed, bottled water that hadn't been opened, an unopened tent in its original packaging, Greg's legal pad with the route still visible and taped to the dashboard, and one disposable camera sitting on the dash with 16 exposures left. The cooler was in the back, still closed, containing ice that had long since melted and sandwiches that had begun to spoil. Lauren's purse was wedged under the passenger seat, containing her wallet, her ID, her credit card, and $43 in cash. Greg's wallet was not in the van. His jacket was draped over the back of the driver's seat. The keys were not in the ignition. Investigators noted no blood, no signs of struggle, no damage to suggest the vehicle had been forced off the road by another driver. The tread marks leading to the ravine were consistent, with a slow, controlled descent rather than a high-speed crash. It looked, in the words of the lead investigator, like someone had simply driven off the road, climbed out, and walked away into the dark. The theory that gained traction in the first 2 weeks was disorientation combined with exhaustion. Greg and Lauren had been driving for over 30 hours with minimal rest, stopping only for meals and one night in a motel. It was possible they had pulled off the highway to sleep or to consult the map, misjudged a turn in the dark, and gone over the edge without realizing how far the drop was or where the road ended and the desert began. Once the vehicle stopped, the theory went, they might have exited through the rear doors, which could still be opened despite the van being on its side, tried to hike back to what they thought was the highway, and become lost in the dark. The temperature had dropped to 38 degrees Fahrenheit on the night of September 26th, cold enough to cause hypothermia within hours if they were underdressed or wet from exertion. Dehydration and exposure could have set in quickly. The Panhandle was a landscape that disoriented even people who knew it well. Search teams combed a 3-mile radius around the ravine for 5 days, working in grids and marking their progress on topographic maps. They found no footprints, no clothing, no remains. Helicopter sweeps turned up nothing. Cadaver dogs were brought in and showed no interest in any direction leading away from the van, which suggested either that the bodies were beyond the search perimeter or that something about the terrain or time elapsed had degraded the scent trail. Volunteers from Amarillo joined the search on the weekend, bringing water and supplies and a determination to find something, anything, that would answer the question of where 2 people could go after climbing out of a van in the middle of the night. They found nothing. Lauren's mother appeared on local news stations in Cleveland and Amarillo, holding the photograph from the driveway and asking anyone who might have seen the couple to come forward. She described Lauren as responsible, careful, not the kind of person who would take unnecessary risks. She said Greg was a good driver who had never been in an accident. She asked viewers to think about whether they'd seen a blue caravan on the side of the road, whether they'd passed someone walking at night, whether they remembered anything at all from late September that might help. The phone lines lit up with tips, most of them well-meaning but useless. A woman in Albuquerque said she'd seen a couple matching their description at a diner, but when pressed, she admitted the timing didn't line up, and the people she remembered had a dog with them. A truck driver said he'd seen a blue van on the shoulder near the state line, but he couldn't confirm the make or model and didn't remember seeing anyone near it. A psychic called to say she'd had a vision of water and rocks, which described half the landscape in the region. Every lead dissolved under scrutiny. Greg's supervisor organized a volunteer search effort that brought 30 people to the Panhandle in mid-October, when the desert was beginning to cool and the mesquite trees had started to drop their leaves. They walked grids, checked abandoned structures, and interviewed anyone living within 20 miles of where the caravan was found. An elderly couple who lived in a trailer on the edge of the search area said they hadn't seen or heard anything unusual in late September, but that it wasn't uncommon for people to get lost out here if they left the main roads. A gas station attendant in a town 40 miles west said she thought she'd seen a couple matching their description on September 27th, but when shown photographs she couldn't be certain and the date didn't align with the timeline. The search continued for another week, and then the weather turned cold and the volunteers went home. By November 1990, the case had been reclassified as a cold missing persons file. The caravan was released to Lauren's mother, who stored it in a garage behind her house and couldn't bring herself to sell it or even look at it for more than a few seconds at a time. The tent, the cooler, and the luggage were catalogued and placed in evidence storage in Amarillo. The one disposable camera was developed as part of standard procedure. The film contained 14 images: Cleveland landmarks, a rest stop in Indiana, a motel parking lot in Missouri, a stretch of highway at sunset, a grain elevator in Oklahoma, and one photograph of Greg holding up the legal pad with the route visible. smiling into the lens with the sun behind him. The final 2 frames on the roll were blank, as if the shutter had been pressed without enough light to register an image, or as if the film had been advanced but never exposed. The photographs were filed with the case materials and referenced in the official report, but they offered no insight into what had happened after the gas station stop on September 26th. What remained was a pattern of assumptions that hardened over time. Greg and Lauren had been good people in a bad situation. They had made a mistake, pulled over in the wrong place, trusted the wrong instinct, or simply driven too far without rest. The Panhandle was a landscape that swallowed things. Animals, weather, and time could erase evidence faster than anyone wanted to believe. The case files included diagrams of the ravine, transcripts of interviews with Raymond Hollister and Clyde Morrison, photographs of the van from multiple angles, and a list of items recovered from inside the vehicle. But the files could not explain the 23-hour gap between the gas station and the ravine, or why 2 people who had been careful enough to write no shortcuts would drive off the highway in the middle of the night onto an unmarked dirt road that led nowhere. Their families held a memorial service in Cleveland in December 1990. No bodies were buried. The service was held at the same church where Lauren and Greg had been married 6 years earlier. Joan Pritchard read a passage from a book Lauren had loved, something about the permanence of memory and the way people you love never really leave. Greg's brother gave a eulogy in which he described his younger sibling as steady, reliable, and someone who always called on birthdays. The church was full, but the gathering afterward felt hollow because there was nothing to mourn in the tangible sense. People ate sandwiches and spoke in low voices about how unfair it was, how senseless, and then they went home. The case stayed open, but the active investigation stopped. The years that followed were marked by the same rituals families of the missing perform when there is no body to mourn and no definitive answer to accept. Lauren's mother kept the powder blue Caravan in the garage until 1998, when a friend convinced her it was time to let it go, that holding on to it was keeping the wound open. It was sold to a salvage yard for parts. Greg's supervisor at the warehouse retired in 2003 and mentioned the case in a letter to a cold case podcast that was just beginning to gain traction online. But the hosts never followed up because they received hundreds of similar letters and didn't have the resources to investigate them all. The legal pad with the route written in Greg's careful handwriting stayed in a file cabinet at the Amarillo Police Department, slowly yellowing under fluorescent light, the ink fading but still legible. In the absence of answers, people filled the silence with guesses. Some believed the couple had staged their own disappearance, though no evidence supported it, and neither had access to the kind of money or planning that would require. There were no secret bank accounts, no passport applications, no signs of marital trouble. Others insisted they had been victims of foul play, perhaps picked up by someone at the gas station or run off the road by another driver with bad intentions, though no witnesses and no secondary evidence had ever surfaced to support that theory. A few believed the couple had simply walked away from their lives, overwhelmed by debt or unhappiness, but that theory collapsed under the weight of what they'd left behind: stable jobs, family who loved them, a house they were 3 years into paying off, and no indication of distress in the weeks leading up to the trip. Co-workers said Greg had been in good spirits, looking forward to the drive. Friends said Lauren had been excited to finally see the canyon after years of talking about it. What no one could explain in any of the theories was the practical question of how. How do 2 people vanish from a vehicle that is later found mostly intact? How do they leave behind their belongings, their money, and their identification? How do they walk into a landscape that would later be searched by helicopters and dogs and find no trace? The absence of answers created a kind of narrative vacuum, and into that vacuum, people poured their fears and assumptions about what the desert could do to the unprepared. By 2010, the case had faded from public memory. It was mentioned occasionally in true crime forums, always with the same inconclusive details and the same unresolved questions. Posters would speculate about exposure, about hidden ravines the search teams might have missed, about the possibility that the bodies had been scattered by coyotes or buried by flash floods that were common in the area during monsoon season. The investigative file remained in storage, technically open but effectively dormant. New leads stopped coming in. The case became one of thousands of cold files that gathered dust in evidence rooms across the country, marked by tragedy, but not by any clear path toward resolution. The families aged. Lauren's mother passed away in 2019 without ever knowing what had happened to her daughter. She left behind the shoebox with the photograph from the driveway and a collection of letters she'd written to Lauren over the years, but never sent because there was no address to send them to. Greg's brother, who had organized search efforts in 1990, moved to Oregon in 2015 and rarely spoke about the case except on anniversaries, when he would post a brief message on social media asking people to share information if they had any. The posts were liked and shared but never led anywhere. The case had become a ghost, present in memory but absent from active investigation. The break came in August 2025, 35 years after the Fentons vanished, and it came from an estate sale in Tucson, Arizona, 400 miles south of where the caravan had been found. A woman named Patricia Oswald was clearing out her late uncle's house. A man named Victor Oswald, who had died in May at the age of 79 after a brief illness. Victor had been a long-haul trucker for 30 years before retiring in 2004. He had lived alone in a small house near the edge of the city, kept to himself, and left behind a house filled with the debris of a solitary life: old maps, tools, boxes of receipts, cassette tapes, and dozens of cameras, lenses, and photography equipment he'd collected over the decades. Victor had been an amateur photographer, the kind of person who took pictures of highway overpasses and truck stops and gas station signs, documenting a version of America that most people drove past without noticing. Patricia hired an estate sale company to sort through the house because she lived in Phoenix and didn't have time to do it herself. On the second day of sorting, a worker named Jenna Caldwell opened a cardboard box labeled 1988-1992 in Victor's spidery handwriting and found 12 disposable cameras, most of them unused, still in their original plastic packaging. One camera had been partially exposed, the film advanced but not fully used. Jenna, acting on instinct more than procedure, took the exposed camera to a photo lab in Tucson that still processed 35mm film as a specialty service, catering to artists and hobbyists who preferred analog photography. The lab returned the prints 3 days later. Most of the images were mundane: truck stops at dawn, highway overpasses silhouetted against orange skies, a motel room with a television showing static, a diner counter with a pie under glass. But 4 of the images stopped Jenna cold. They showed 2 people, a man and a woman, inside what appeared to be a vehicle. The lighting was dim, the focus soft, but the faces were visible. The woman was looking directly at the camera with an expression that could have been surprise or fear or simply confusion, her mouth slightly open, as if she'd been interrupted mid-sentence. The man had his hand raised as if gesturing to stop, his palm toward the lens. And in the final image, blurred and slightly out of frame, there was a hand-scrawled message on what looked like a napkin or piece of paper held up to the lens. The message was visible enough to read, "Turn back." Jenna showed the photographs to her supervisor at the estate sale company, who looked at them for a long moment and said they seemed odd but couldn't place why. Jenna couldn't shake the feeling that the faces looked familiar, or that the urgency in the handwritten message meant something. She took the prints home that evening and searched online for missing persons cases from 1990, filtering by location and time period. Within 2 hours, she'd found a forum post about Greg and Lauren Fenton, dated from 2018, with photographs attached. She compared the faces in Victor's photographs to the images from the forum and felt her stomach drop. It was them. She was certain. Jenna contacted a cold case tip line the next morning. The photographs reached the Amarillo Police Department on August 14, 2025. A forensic analyst named Philip Reeves compared the faces in the new images to the photographs taken from the Fentons' developed camera, the one showing Greg holding the legal pad, and to their driver's license photos from 1990. The match was definitive. The bone structure, the hairline, the shape of Lauren's jaw, and Greg's eyebrows. It was them. Lauren and Greg Fenton were the people in the images. The camera that took the pictures had belonged to someone else. The investigation that followed moved quickly because the new evidence narrowed the timeline in a way 35 years of speculation had not. The photographs proved that Greg and Lauren had been alive and in the presence of another person after leaving the gas station on September 26, 1990. The camera that took the images had been in the possession of Victor Oswald, a long-haul trucker who had driven routes through the Texas Panhandle in 1990. Investigators pulled Victor's employment records from the trucking company he'd worked for, cross-referenced his delivery logs, and found that on September 26 and 27, 1990, he had been driving a route from Amarillo to Flagstaff with a scheduled stop near the New Mexico border. The route matched the area where the caravan had been found. Victor had logged a fuel stop at 2:47 a.m. on September 27, 1990, at a station 12 miles from the ravine where the Fenton's van was later discovered. Victor Oswald had died before he could be questioned, but his house yielded more. Investigators obtained a warrant and searched the property with Patricia's cooperation. They found a journal he'd kept sporadically between 1989 and 1995, written in a cramped hand on the inside covers of old road atlases. Most entries were logistical: fuel costs, delivery times, maintenance notes, complaints about dispatchers and traffic. But on a page dated September 27, 1990, tucked into an atlas of the Southwest, there was a single sentence. Couple off 66. Wouldn't listen. Kept going. The entry was brief, vague, and maddeningly incomplete, but it aligned with the timeline and the photographs. Investigators also found a second disposable camera in the same box, this one undeveloped. When processed, it contained 3 images, one showing the exterior of the powder blue caravan parked on a shoulder at night, the headlights visible in the frame, one showing tire tracks in dirt leading off the road, and one showing the edge of the ravine in daylight, with the van visible below, resting on its side against the juniper trees. The photographs had been taken by someone standing outside the vehicle, looking down at the scene. The reconstruction began with what could be verified. On the night of September 26, 1990, Greg and Lauren Fenton left the gas station outside Amarillo at approximately 11:25 p.m. and continued west on Route 66. At some point, between 11:25 p.m. and 2:47 a.m., they encountered Victor Oswald, most likely on a stretch of old Route 66, where the road ran close to the interstate, but was less traveled and poorly lit. The exact nature of the encounter couldn't be fully reconstructed from the evidence, but the photographs and the journal entry suggested Victor had tried to warn them about something, a road condition, a turn, a hazard he'd noticed, and they had not heeded the warning. Investigators theorized that Victor, driving the same route and familiar with the area from previous hauls, had noticed the Fenton's vehicle on the shoulder or seen them take a turn onto a side road that led toward the ravine. The side road, an unmarked dirt track used occasionally by ranchers, was easy to mistake for a shortcut in the dark, especially for drivers who were tired and unfamiliar with the terrain. Victor may have stopped, approached their vehicle, and tried to redirect them. The photographs showing Lauren and Greg inside the van, with Greg's hand raised and Lauren's expression uncertain, suggested a tense interaction, someone stepping into their space, holding a camera, trying to make a point they didn't understand or didn't want to hear. The turn back message, written on what forensic analysts determined was a napkin from the gas station where they'd last been seen, based on the logo partially visible in the photograph, suggested the warning had been direct and urgent. But the Fentons, tired and possibly frustrated by the detour or suspicious of a stranger approaching them in the middle of the night, had continued on. The journal entry, "Wouldn't listen, kept going," supported that interpretation. Victor had taken photographs of the encounter, possibly to document his attempt to help, or simply because he carried a camera as part of his habit of documenting the road, and then continued his own route. The timeline tightened further when investigators cross-referenced the fuel stop Victor logged at 2:47 a.m. with the location of the ravine. If the Fentons had ignored his warning and driven south on the unpaved side road, thinking it was a shortcut back to the highway or simply following their headlights without realizing where the road led, they would have encountered the ravine within 15 to 20 minutes. The road was poorly marked, and in the dark it would have been difficult to see where the ground dropped away. The tire tracks leading to the edge, documented in the original investigation, suggested they had been driving slowly, trying to navigate by headlights, and had gone over before realizing the danger. The fact that the van came to rest on its side and that there was no fire or catastrophic damage suggested they survived the initial descent. What happened after they exited the vehicle remained the hardest part to reconstruct, but investigators worked with what they had. The absence of their bodies near the ravine and the lack of footprints leading away documented in the original search suggested they had tried to walk back toward what they thought was the road, but had become disoriented. The Panhandle at night, especially in late September, was a disorienting landscape, flat in some places, broken by small canyons and washes in others, with few landmarks and no artificial light. Visibility was limited to what the moon provided, and on the night of September 26, 1990, the moon had been in its last quarter, providing minimal illumination. If Greg and Lauren had climbed out of the van through the rear doors, assessed their situation, and decided to walk back to the highway rather than wait for help, they would have faced several problems. First, the ravine was deeper than it appeared from above, and climbing back up would have been difficult, especially in the dark. Second, once they reached the top, the dirt road they'd driven down would have been nearly invisible without headlights to mark it. Third, the desert in that region was crisscrossed with dry washes and rocky outcroppings that all looked similar in the dark. If they veered off course by even a few degrees, they could have walked for miles without intersecting the search grids that would later be deployed. Dehydration would have set in within hours. The temperature dropped to 38 degrees, cold enough to cause hypothermia if they were sweating from exertion and then stopped moving. Exhaustion would have clouded their judgment. If they'd walked through the night and into the next day without finding the highway, exposure would have become critical. Animals and weather would have scattered remains over time. Flash floods, common in the area during monsoon season, could have buried or moved remains. Scavengers could have dispersed bones over a wide area, making them nearly impossible to find even with modern search techniques. The photograph Victor took of the ravine in daylight, the one showing the van on its side against the juniper trees, suggested he had returned to the scene, possibly the next day during his return route, and documented what he found. The image was taken from the same vantage point as the nighttime photo showing the tire tracks, which meant Victor had walked to the edge of the ravine, looked down, and seen the van below. But Victor had not reported the scene. He had not called authorities. He had taken the photographs, kept the cameras, and carried the knowledge for 35 years without speaking. The reasons for his silence could only be inferred from what was known about his life. Victor Oswald had been a solitary man with a deep distrust of institutions, documented in other journal entries where he complained about DOT inspections, fines for minor violations, and interactions with law enforcement that he described as harassment. In one entry from 1991, he wrote about being pulled over for a broken taillight and being detained for 2 hours while his truck was searched. In another, he described a dispatcher who had threatened to fire him over a late delivery that wasn't his fault. The pattern suggested someone who had learned to avoid official scrutiny, who believed that getting involved would create problems rather than solve them. It was possible Victor feared being implicated in the Fentons' disappearance, feared losing his job, or simply convinced himself that the couple had already been found, or that reporting it days later would do no good. He may have believed that coming forward would raise questions about why he'd been at the scene, why he'd taken photographs, why he'd waited. He may have told himself that he'd done what he could by trying to warn them, and that what happened after was not his responsibility. Whatever his reasoning, he had taken the photographs, stored them in a box, and carried the knowledge to his grave. The cameras sat untouched for 35 years until his niece hired an estate sale company to clear out his house. The case, once the photographs surfaced and the timeline was reconstructed, was officially reclassified from missing persons to accidental death, with remains unrecovered. The evidence supported the conclusion that Greg and Lauren Fenton had driven off Route 66 onto an unmarked side road late at night, ignored or misunderstood a warning from a passing trucker, and gone into a ravine they couldn't see in the dark. They had exited the vehicle, attempted to find help, and died of exposure in the hours or days that followed. Their bodies, scattered by time and scavengers and possibly weather, were never located despite renewed search efforts in 2025 that used ground-penetrating radar, drones with thermal imaging, and cadaver dogs across a wider area than the original 1990 search had covered. The revelation brought a measure of clarity to the families, though clarity is not the same as peace. Greg's brother, when informed of the findings by a detective from the Amarillo Police Department in September 2025, said he was relieved to finally know his brother hadn't suffered violence at the hands of another person. But the knowledge that a warning had been ignored, and that Victor Oswald had chosen silence over reporting what he'd seen, left a bitterness that wouldn't fade. He said it felt like a preventable tragedy, like if Victor had just made one phone call, the search would have started days earlier and maybe the outcome would have been different. The detective reminded him that the van wasn't found until October 9th, 8 days after Victor's photographs were taken, and that by then the damage was already done. But Greg's brother couldn't let go of the what-ifs. Lauren's surviving cousin, a woman named Rebecca who had been 14 in 1990, and barely remembered her cousin except as someone who sent birthday cards with handwritten notes, said the hardest part was imagining the moment they realized they were lost and that no one was coming. She said it was worse in some ways than not knowing at all, because now the story had an ending, and the ending was slow and lonely and preventable. She asked the detective if there was any evidence they'd stayed together, if they'd tried to comfort each other, and the detective said there was no way to know. The evidence could tell them what had happened, but not how it had felt. The photographs themselves became a subject of scrutiny and discomfort. The image of Lauren looking at the camera, her expression unreadable in the dim light, was reproduced in articles about the case, but always with the acknowledgement that it captured a moment of fear or confusion that had not been understood at the time. Ethicists and journalists debated whether the photographs should be published at all, given that they documented the final hours of two people who couldn't consent to their distribution. In the end, most publications ran only one image, the exterior shot of the caravan at night, and described the others without showing them. The turn-back message, scrawled on a napkin in handwriting that was later determined to be Victor's, became a symbol of the case, a warning that had come too late, delivered by someone who had not stayed long enough to see it through. In the months after the photographs surfaced, journalists retraced the route the Fentons had taken. The gas station outside Amarillo where they'd stopped was still operating, though under different ownership. The attendant who had been working that night, Raymond Hollister, had passed away in 2017, so there was no one left who remembered them firsthand. The side road they were believed to have taken was now gated and marked with no trespassing signs, though the gate had not existed in 1990. The ravine itself was accessible only by foot, and a reporter from a Phoenix newspaper who visited in September 2025 described it as unremarkable, a shallow drop in a landscape full of shallow drops, distinguishable only by what had happened there 35 years earlier, and by the faded remnants of police tape still clinging to a juniper tree. Victor Oswald's estate, once the photographs became public, was briefly the subject of legal inquiries. Patricia Oswald, his niece, cooperated fully with investigators and expressed regret that her uncle had never spoken about the encounter. She described him as a man who kept his own counsel, who had spent decades on the road and rarely shared what he'd seen. She said he'd been kind to her when she was young but distant, and that after he retired he'd become even more withdrawn. She donated the journals and cameras to the Amarillo Police Department as evidence, and offered a small portion of his estate to the Fenton family as a gesture of apology, though it was declined. Greg's brother said money wouldn't change anything, and that what he wanted was an explanation Victor could no longer provide. The case, as it stands now, is considered resolved in the technical sense. The central question, what happened to Greg and Lauren Fenton after they left the gas station on September 26, 1990, has an answer. They drove off the highway, ignored a warning from a stranger they had no reason to trust, went into a ravine they couldn't see, and died trying to find their way back. The camera that documented their final hours was found 35 years later in a box in Tucson, and the man who took the photographs carried the knowledge to his grave. But resolution is not the same as satisfaction, and the case leaves a question that can't be answered by evidence or reconstruction. What would have happened if Victor Oswald had stayed? If he'd insisted more forcefully, if he'd called for help that night instead of logging a fuel stop and moving on? The Fenton case is taught now in courses on cold case investigation as an example of how a single piece of physical evidence can reshape a narrative that has calcified over decades. The photographs are stored in a climate-controlled archive at the Amarillo Police Department, and the cameras that took them are catalogued as evidence. The powder blue Caravan, long since sold for scrap and dismantled, exists now only in the photograph from the driveway, the one showing Lauren holding the Atlas and Greg mock saluting, both of them unaware that the route they were about to take would end in a ravine 11 miles off the highway, and that the proof of what happened would stay hidden in a box for 35 years before it saw light again.